Hello there, this is going to be that coaching video that we make available to you every week for those of you who lead facilitating our teaching, an on-campus small group. And if you find yourself in one of those roles, then this video should help you as you prepare to do that for this Sunday, October the 7th. Now, what we're going to be doing this Sunday is we're going to be kicking off a brand new sermon series we're calling Redeeming Love. We're going to actually be studying through the book of Ruth for several Sundays together. It's going to be a great, exciting study as we learn about God's redemption through the story of Ruth and Naomi. So you don't want to miss this series. Now, also for help us in that, what we're going to be doing in our own campus small groups is we're going to be doing a study that is linked to the promises of God, because you're going to see in the book of Ruth how God's promises, when followed, they bring about God's work and blessing of our life. But when we disregard those promises and fail to live by them, then we have to deal with the consequences of that. So what we're going to be doing is looking at these over the next several weeks, and to complement this series, we're going to be focusing in on about the promises of God and what does it mean that God makes promises to us. And this first lesson is going to be exactly that. So hopefully you got the email already that had the lesson there attached to it. You got that printed out. If you want to grab your Bible, do that. Of course, certainly grab something to write some thoughts down, and let's kind of just take a few minutes to kind of give a good overview, wrap up of this lesson, and maybe suggest a few things to help you there. Okay, now you've got your lesson in front of you, and you can look at the different things there. We, of course, got on the first page is our overview, gives you the big idea, and the big idea helps us understand exactly what we're going to get into the details of the lesson. And the big idea is this: because God is a promise keeper, we can follow him with complete confidence. We need to back that up, though, but he's not only a promise keeper, he's a promise giver. And we're going to be talking about that and looking at that. And what we're going to be doing in this first lesson, instead of getting into maybe some specific promises or even specific areas of promise, we're going to look at it in more of a bird's eye view. And what we're going to be looking is kind of the theology of promise and looking at the aspect of promise and how that is found throughout the Bible. We mentioned in the lesson that the Bible is actually, the motif of the Bible is a promise. God makes promises, and God carries out those promises, and he chooses to relate to us on promises. And one thing to keep in mind is that God has chosen to do that when he doesn't have to. And we certainly can't earn or deserve his promises, but God chooses to give us those promises out of his grace and through his love for us. And so we'll be looking at that aspect as we go through here. Now we're going to be focusing in on a couple of verses, as a matter of fact, out of 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. Those verses may sound familiar to you because several months ago we actually did a whole sermon series out of those verses and the ones following it. But we're going to come back and revisit those, especially focusing in on the phrase that speaks about the promises of God there. And so go ahead and be aware of that as we move into. Now, what we're going to be emphasizing in this lesson is the fact that God is a promiser. I may have just made up a word, but in other words, that he is the one who gives promises. He operates on the basis of promises with his people, with us. But even more than that, he is a promise keeper. He always comes through on his promises. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one is he has the power to bring his promises about. You know, we make promises sometimes, and there's things that we have no control over, that we don't have any ability to deal with, that can hinder us maybe from carrying those promises out. For example, I may say, hey, tell my wife, I'm traveling, but I'm going to be back in Mobile Sunday night. I promise I'll be there. Well, what happens if my plane gets delayed in Atlanta, or my flight gets canceled, and then I'm not able to get another flight until Monday and I arrive a day late? I broke that promise because I didn't have the power to make it happen. I didn't have the power to carry it about. Some of you may say, well, that was a foolish promise to make the way air travel is, but it's an illustration, okay? The other reason that God always comes through on his promises is because that's consistent with who he is. The person of God guarantees that. That's his character. The Bible says that God is not a man that he should lie. When God says something, he's going to do it. His character requires that of him. He can't operate contrary to who he is because he's God. Now, that's not true of me and you, because we have a sin nature. And that sin nature rises up in us at times, and we may make a promise, and maybe at that point we had every intention of keeping that promise, but something happens within inside of us, and we get bent a different way or whatever, and we choose to break that promise. That will never happen with God, because He is God, His character determines that His promise will always come about. Now, in 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, as you go through the material there, or the content of the lesson, you're going to see that we focus on a couple of things there in looking at the concept of promise. And we're going to pull out two descriptions that Peter gives to the promise of God to help us in this. And one is he talks about how great God's promises are. And we go into some detail about that and throw some things out. And as Peter helps us understand the magnitude of the promise that God's made. It is great. In other words, it is more than any other that you will ever see. God's promises are always have the attribute of greatness to them. And one is because they're made by a great God. So when great God makes a promise, it's going to be great. And secondly, because it addresses the great issues of our life and addresses things we deal with. And we kind of point that out. I think that's a good point to hang on to as you go through that section. The other thing is talks about God's precious promise is the word that's used there. And we give you in the lesson a little bit of word background in that regards there that may be helpful for you. But bottom line, when he uses the word precious, he's talking about the value of God's promise. God's promises are valuable. They have value, great worth to them. And what makes them great worth is because He always carries them out. And of course, they're backed up by God Himself. And so those two concepts are going to be very important as you work your way through this material and as you look at it and getting a hold on this theology of promise that we're going to be looking at. Now, the first teaching point simply points out that God is a promiser. He's a promise giver. That's how He chooses to relate to us. But He's also not just one who throws out promises. He's one who always brings His promises to fruition. He always carries them out. And then the second point then speaks about this, what we just mentioned to you there, that God is, that He, as we trust His promises, He does a supernatural work in us. In other words, as we put faith, as we believe His promise, we embrace them, we hang on to them, we hold on to them, and we base our life off of the promise of God, then we can know that God is going to do a supernatural work in us. And that's a very key aspect of what that passage speaks about, because then he talks about the work that God does in us for godliness. But he also speaks about how our faith activates the promise of God, the promises of God in our life. And here might be a good thing to do with your small group, is this might be a good time to kind of pause in the lesson as you're talking and just get some of the people some feedback from your group. Ask them to throw out some of the promises that they're aware of that God has given them, and maybe some of the promises they've seen be realized in their life. And this makes a good group interaction, especially in talking about how that sense of that promise maybe has carried them through a challenging time, or they're seeing that promise get fulfilled, how that has given them confidence for the future and living life, walking with Jesus, whatever that may be. But this would be a good time to do that. Now, one caution on that, okay? One caution is because there may be some promises that get thrown out that maybe don't exactly apply to us today or apply to us as individuals. Because, see, God makes promises throughout the Bible. There's a record of those, and we see the results of those promises. But not every promise in the Bible is for me or you. God at certain times has made specific promises for a certain people at a definite time. For instance, in Genesis chapter 12, and that gives us a promise, and then he also repeats it in chapter 17 and in chapter 19. But he gives this promise to Abraham. And what is the promise? The promise is to Abraham that he will be the beginning of a great nation from his offspring, from his child, his son, will grow a great nation. And that nation will be called Israel. And that nation will also have a particular place that they will live, a land that he gives to them. Now, we know when we read the Bible that we see that's exactly what happened. But God gave that promise to Abraham. He didn't give it to me, and he doesn't give it to you. So we have to be careful, make sure in looking at the context of that promise, that those promises, that we do not try to claim or try to live out a promise that was not given for us there. So just keep that in mind. The promises of God, as I've said, will always come through, and that gives us the confidence we need to trust God and to live our life based on His promise. Now, the third teaching point speaks about the fact there that all of the promises of God ultimately find their culmination, their fruition, their realization in the person of Jesus Christ. God's those promises of God are ours as followers of Jesus, not because of anything that we do or don't do, but those promises are ours because of who Jesus is and what He has done. And when we put our faith and trust in Jesus, then God's promises become ours because they come to us through Jesus, because it is all about Jesus. So keep that in mind as you work through, and that's the thing we got to really help our small group understand. And it all comes back to Jesus and who He is and what He has done, and the salvation, the redemption, the redeeming love that He has for us. And by the way, if I haven't mentioned it earlier, let me do this right now. Let's remember that all the promises of God flow to us out of His great love for us as well. Don't forget to take some time to use your application moment to talk through some of the things that you've learned, that you've discussed, that's come up. Help that drive it home even further and how that works out in our lives as Jesus followers. You've got a memory verse to learn this week. Encourage your small group members to be memorizing the scriptures. And then to wrap up there, there's a little conclusion maybe can help you as you wrap up your time together. Appreciate what you do. Thanks for being a small group leader, facilitator, teacher, however you define that role. But thanks for what you do and how you do it, your faithfulness in that. Always let me know how I can help you. And I'm looking forward to this month of being able to experience together and understanding more about the redeeming love of God as we study on Sunday in a large group gathering and our weekly gathering, as we teach through the book of Ruth, but also as you share together in your small group about God's promise. 'Cause you make me believe.